How Britain's ridiculous landship terrified the German army in World War I. September 15th, 1916. A young German artilleryman named Heinrich is writing what might be his last letter home. His hands are shaking, not from the cold, not from exhaustion, but from what he just saw crawling toward him through the smoke. He writes, "We destroyed an armoured automobile. It was curiously X-shaped and powered by two enormous shovels which duck into the ground, pulling the vehicle forward." Here's the thing nobody tells you about the first tanks. The Germans thought they were hallucinating. Grown men, battle-hardened soldiers, threw down their rifles and ran screaming from what they called devil's machines. But there's something darker in Heinrich's letter. Something about what happened when that machine reached his position that changed warfare forever. And before you understand why these ridiculous landships worked, you need to know what it felt like to be on the receiving end. Look, by September 1916, the Somme wasn't a battle anymore. It was a meat grinder. Heinrich and his regiment had been sitting in those trenches for months, watching British attacks get shredded by their machine guns like clockwork. They'd seen everything the British could throw at them. Artillery barrages that turned the earth inside out. Poison gas that rolled across no man's land like fog from hell. Wave after wave of infantry charging into wire and bullets. And every single time, the same result. The British died. The Germans survived. The war continued. Heinrich was 22 years old. A farmer's son from Bavaria. Before the war, his biggest worry was whether the wheat harvest would be good enough to afford new boots. Now his world had shrunk to a 6-foot-wide trench carved into French mud, shared with rats the size of cats, and the constant, gnawing certainty that tomorrow might be the day a shell had his name on it. But at least the rules made sense. At least there was a logic to the horror. The British would mass their troops. The artillery would announce the attack with a bombardment that could be heard in London. Then the infantry would go over the top and Heinrich's machine guns would cut them down. Simple, terrible, predictable. His battery had become so efficient at it that the officers could time their cigarette breaks around the rhythm of British attacks. On the morning of September 15th, Heinrich was actually feeling confident. The latest bombardment had lifted around dawn, right on schedule. Through the smoke and morning mist, he could see the familiar sight of British infantry forming up for another charge. Another day, another slaughter. His commanding officer was joking with the gun crews, pointing out targets, placing bets on how long this attack would last before the British fell back to lick their wounds. The machine guns opened up right on cue. Heinrich watched through the smoke as columns of Tommies, those British soldiers, most of them probably just kids like him, farm boys and factory workers who'd been promised glory and got mud and death instead, as they stumbled forward into the wire. The familiar sound of bullets finding flesh, the screams, the bodies piling up in the crater-pocked wasteland between the trenches. Everything was going exactly as it always went. And that confidence, that routine, that sense that he understood how this war worked, that's exactly what made what happened next so soul-crushing. Because through the smoke, shapes started to emerge. Big shapes, moving shapes that didn't look like anything Heinrich had ever seen. At first, his brain tried to make sense of them. Artillery tractors, maybe? Some new kind of supply vehicle that the British had accidentally sent too far forward? His commanding officer actually laughed, actually pointed at these lumbering shadows in the distance and made a joke about British incompetence. "Look at those fools," he probably said. "They've sent farm equipment to fight us." That laughter died in about 15 seconds. Because these shapes kept coming, kept growing larger, and as the smoke cleared and the morning light hit them at just the right angle, Heinrich's brain finally processed what his eyes were showing him. These weren't tractors. These weren't any kind of vehicle he'd ever seen. These were monsters, metal monsters, 28 tons of riveted steel plate crawling across the earth on tracks that looked like they belonged on some kind of industrial mining equipment, not a weapon of war. The first one that came into clear view, Heinrich would later learn the British crew had nicknamed it Dinneken, though in that moment he had no idea these things had names, had crews, had any humanity inside them at all. The first one just rolled right into the British barbed wire, and that's when everything Heinrich knew about warfare fell apart. See, German barbed wire wasn't some token barrier. This wasn't a garden fence. These were industrial steel cables, thick as a man's thumb, twisted and coiled and strung between posts driven 6 feet into the ground, layer after layer, creating a forest of razor-sharp metal 30 feet deep in places. For 2 years, that wire had been the real hero of the German defence. It slowed the British infantry to a crawl, bunched them up into perfect targets, made them easy pickings for the machine guns. That wire was sacred. That wire was safety. That wire was the thin line between Heinrich and death. And this machine just ate it. Heinrich described the sound in his letter. He said, "The wire screamed." That's the phrase that stayed with him. The wire screamed. The tank's tracks grabbed those massive steel cables, yanked the posts right out of the earth like they were weeds, and just dragged the whole mess underneath itself, grinding it into the mud while the machine kept crawling forward without even slowing down. The sound of all that metal twisting and shrieking and breaking. Heinrich said it sounded like the earth itself was being murdered. His battery panicked, started throwing everything they had at this thing. Grenades arcing through the air, bouncing off the steel plating like pebbles thrown at a castle wall. Machine gun fire that just sparked and whined and did absolutely nothing. Heinrich himself fired his artillery piece directly at it, watched the shell explode against its flank and saw nothing. No damage, no effect. The thing just kept coming, slow and unstoppable, its machine guns spitting fire from sponsons on its sides, its main guns swiveling toward his position. And then, just when Heinrich thought his mind was going to break completely trying to process this impossible thing, it stopped. The engine coughed, belched a huge cloud of black smoke. The whole machine shuddered and went still. For one beautiful, desperate second, Heinrich thought maybe God still cared. Maybe this nightmare was over. Maybe there was still justice in the universe and machines like this couldn't really exist. That's when he looked around and realized his entire regiment was already gone. Not dead. Gone. Fled. Run away. White flags were popping up across the trench line like flowers after a spring rain. Men who'd held this position through months of bombardment, who'd stood their ground against gas attacks and artillery and endless waves of British infantry. Those same men had taken one look at this metal monster and decided that surrender was better than facing it. And Heinrich couldn't even judge them for it because every instinct in his body was screaming at him to do the same thing. This is what the British planners understood that nobody talks about. The tank didn't have to be good, it didn't have to work perfectly. It just had to exist. Because the moment that wire came down, that sacred barrier that kept men sane by giving them distance from death, something broke inside every German soldier watching. It wasn't courage that failed them, it was the math. Your brain does a calculation. Can I stop this thing with what I have? And when the answer is no, when your weapons are useless, when your fortress is meaningless, you don't stand and die heroically, you run. But here's the part that'll mess with your head. While Heinrich's watching this unstoppable demon crawl toward his position, while his entire world is collapsing around this impossible machine, inside that tank, a mechanic named William Speechley from Leeds is absolutely convinced he's about to die. The British called these things landships. Churchill himself had championed them, convinced they'd be the key to breaking the trench deadlock. But the crews, the men who actually had to climb inside these steel coffins and drive them into battle, they had another name for them. They called them moving tombs. And they weren't being dramatic. Picture this. You're locked inside a steel box, 28 tons of riveted metal plates with barely any ventilation. It's September, but inside this thing it's 140 degrees Fahrenheit. You're wearing a leather helmet and chainmail over your face to protect against metal splinters when bullets hit the armor, but the chainmail just traps the heat against your skin. You're sweating through your uniform within minutes. The engine, 2 separate engines actually, one for each track because that's how primitive these first tanks were. The engines are roaring at maximum volume right behind you. So loud you can't hear your own thoughts. So loud that you're communicating with your crew entirely through hand signals because shouting is useless. The exhaust fumes are filling the interior because nobody really thought about ventilation when they designed this thing. Carbon monoxide is slowly poisoning you. You can taste metal in your mouth. Your head is pounding. Some crews actually passed out from the fumes during longer drives, and you can't see where you're going because there's exactly one tiny slit to look through and it's covered in mud within the first 30 seconds of crossing no man's land. Oh, and if a shell hits you, if the Germans get lucky with their artillery, the armor might stop the shell from penetrating, but the impact sends the rivets on the inside exploding inward like shrapnel, shredding everyone inside the tank. The crews called it splash. Men had been blinded, killed, maimed by their own armor, turning into fragmentation grenades inside the enclosed space. And if the engine caught fire, which happened a lot because these early engines were finicky and prone to overheating, if the engine caught fire, you had maybe 30 seconds to get out before you burned alive. If the hatches didn't jam, which they often did, Speechley knew all of this. Every man in that tank knew it. They'd trained together. They'd seen other tanks burst into flames during trials. They'd heard the screams. They knew they were driving a death trap into the most heavily defended position on the Western Front, and their only advantages were surprise and the hope that the Germans would be too shocked to aim properly. So when that German shell hit their flank, when Speechley felt the entire tank shudder from the impact, when he heard the deafening clang of metal on metal and waited for the rivets to turn his crew into hamburger, he didn't feel invincible. He felt his mortality in his teeth. He tasted blood from biting his own tongue. He looked at the driver next to him and saw the same terror in his eyes. They were all certain in that moment that this was it. This was how they died. Inside this steel oven, unable to see, unable to run, unable to do anything but wait for the next shell to finish the job. But the tank held. The armour, by some miracle of engineering or luck or divine intervention, actually worked. The shell glanced off. The rivets didn't fragment. And Speechley had to keep driving, keep pushing forward, because stopping meant becoming an easy target. And an easy target in a tank meant everyone inside died screaming. This is what makes the whole story so twisted. The tank's power wasn't that it protected the crew, it barely did. Its power was the illusion of invincibility it created for the enemy. Heinrich sees an unstoppable monster, a devil's machine that shrugs off everything his army can throw at it. Speechley's drowning in his own sweat, praying the engine doesn't seize, knowing he's one mechanical failure away from a tomb, one lucky German shell away from burning alive inside a steel cage. Same machine, two completely different nightmares. And here's the cruel irony that makes this whole thing so dark. The psychological weapon only works because Heinrich can't see how fragile the thing actually is. Can't see Speechley vomiting from the heat and fumes. Can't see the driver's hands shaking on the controls. Can't see the gunner praying in the corner because his nerve's about to break. If Heinrich could see inside, could see how close this machine is to failure, could see the human terror mirroring his own, maybe the spell would break. Maybe the illusion would shatter, but he can't. And so the machine keeps its power. The monster stays monstrous. And both men on opposite sides of the armor plate are trapped in their own private hells, neither knowing that the other is just as scared, just as human, just as desperate for this to be over. Let me tell you about the exact moment everything changed. Not just for Heinrich, not just for that battle, but for how humans understood war itself. The moment when warfare became something his ancestors wouldn't recognize. Dinneken, that British tank with its crew of terrified kids from Leeds and London, reached the edge of Heinrich's trench line. The barbed wire was gone, ground into the mud. The machine gun positions had been silenced or abandoned. And now this metal monster was sitting maybe 50 yards from where Heinrich stood, its engine still running, that terrible mechanical growl that sounded like nothing natural, nothing that should exist in a world where wars were fought by men. Heinrich's battery tried everything. They had grenades, the stick grenades that German soldiers called potato mashers because of their long wooden handles. They threw them at the tank, watched them bounce off the armoured sides and explode uselessly in the mud. They tried to shoot through the viewing slits, tried to jam something into the tracks. Nothing worked. The tank was impervious to everything they had. And then it happened. The thing that broke Heinrich. The thing that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The tank stopped moving. Not because they'd damaged it, not because they'd fought it off, but because the engine had finally given up. It sat there, immobile, belching smoke, essentially useless as a fighting vehicle, a broken down piece of equipment that couldn't advance or retreat or do anything except exist. By all military logic, this should have been a victory for Heinrich's battery. They'd stopped the advance. The monster was dead, but it didn't matter. Because all around him, his comrades were surrendering anyway, throwing down their rifles, raising their hands, white flags appearing from dugouts and trenches all along the line. Hundreds of German soldiers giving up, not to the tank's guns, but to its presence, to the idea of it, to what it represented. Heinrich watched officers, men who'd led their troops through years of this war, who'd stood firm through artillery barrages that literally reshaped the landscape, watched these officers walk forward with their hands up, surrendering to a machine that couldn't even move anymore. And he understood in that moment that something fundamental had changed, not just in this battle, not just in this war, but in all wars, forever. See, warfare for thousands of years had been human against human. Your courage mattered. Your skill mattered. Your training, your strength, your will to fight, these things determined outcomes. A brave man could turn a battle. A skilled warrior could defeat multiple opponents. Individual human excellence had value, had meaning. Wars were still terrible, still tragic, still meat grinders of death and suffering. But at least human qualities mattered. At least men could look at themselves and think, I fought well, I was brave, I did my duty. The tank destroyed all of that, made it meaningless. Didn't matter how brave Heinrich was, didn't matter how well trained his battery was, didn't matter that they'd held this position through months of attacks. The machine rendered all of it obsolete. And the worst part, the part that really broke something in Heinrich's mind, it wasn't even a good machine. It was slow, it was clumsy, it broke down constantly. By any objective measure, it was a ridiculous invention that barely worked. But it didn't have to be good. It just had to be better than courage, better than training, better than human will. And it was. Easily, almost contemptuously. Heinrich ended up captured. He's standing there with hundreds of other German prisoners, being marched back toward British lines. And here's what broke him completely. It wasn't losing. Soldiers understand losing. War has winners and losers. That's the nature of combat. No. What broke Heinrich was watching the British tank crews climb out of their machines. These weren't giants. They weren't some master race of super soldiers. They were kids, farm boys, and factory workers. Guys who looked exactly like Heinrich's friends back home. And they were in bad shape. Really bad shape. Staggering out of the tanks, some of them collapsing immediately in the mud, vomiting from the heat and the fumes, shaking uncontrollably, hands trembling so badly they couldn't light their own cigarettes. Some of them were crying. Just sitting in the mud, crying, unable to stop. Heinrich watched one tanker, probably speechly, though he didn't know names, would never know names, watched him stumble away from his machine, pull off his leather helmet and chainmail face covering, and just stand there, gasping like a man who'd nearly drowned. His uniform was soaked through with sweat. His face was pale, almost green. His eyes had that 1,000-yard stare that Heinrich recognized from his own face in the mirror. The look of a man who'd seen something that changed him. Something he couldn't unsee. And Heinrich writes in his letter, this is the line that hits like a punch to the gut. He writes, "They didn't defeat us with courage or strength. They defeated us with a machine that neither of us controls." Think about that sentence. Really think about it. This German soldier sitting in a prisoner of war camp, writing to his mother, trying to make sense of what he experienced. And that's what he comes up with. Not they were braver than us, not they outfought us. But the machine defeated us both, because that's what he saw. The British crews were just as traumatized as the Germans. Maybe more so because they'd been inside that steel hell for hours. They hadn't won through superiority or skill or courage. They'd won because they were willing to suffer through operating a machine that terrorized both sides. The tank was a weapon against everyone. Against the Germans it faced and against the British who crewed it. It traumatized everyone it touched. And that's when you realize what terrified really means in the title of this video. It's not about fear of death. Soldiers have always feared death. That's not new, that's not special. The terror of the Landship was something way more permanent, way more insidious. It was the terror of obsolescence, the terror of irrelevance, the terror of realizing that your humanity, your courage, your training, your will, none of it mattered anymore. War had moved beyond you, had evolved past the point where human qualities determined outcomes. You were now a spectator to your own defeat, watching machines decide your fate. The real terror of the Landship wasn't mechanical, it was existential. It proved that wars could now be fought by machines that made human courage irrelevant, and both sides understood this immediately. Both sides looked at these 32 clumsy, broken down, barely functional tanks stumbling across the Somme and saw the same future, saw where this was heading, saw what war would become. Heinrich was right to be scared, because everything he feared came true, in ways even he couldn't imagine. Fast forward to the Gulf War in 1991. American M1 Abrams tanks are obliterating Iraqi positions from 2 miles away. 2 miles. The Iraqis can't even see what's killing them. Their Soviet-made tanks are no match. Their rounds bounce off if they get lucky enough to spot the Americans first, which is rare because the Abrams have thermal imaging and can fight at night, in sandstorms, in conditions where human eyes are useless. It's not a battle, it's extermination. clinical, mechanical, impersonal. Iraqi soldiers surrender in their thousands, entire divisions giving up without a fight, walking toward American lines with white flags begging to be taken prisoner. And the American tankers, they're not even scared. They're bored. Some of them never even saw the enemy they were killing. Just shapes on thermal sights, targets that disappeared when you pressed a button. Video game warfare, except the death was real. It's the Somme on steroids. Same psychological collapse, same mass surrenders, same enemy reduced to spectators at their own defeat. Heinrich's nightmare evolved, but the core terror remained exactly the same. Human beings made obsolete by machines. Courage and training and will rendered meaningless by technology. And the really scary part, the Americans in those tanks felt nothing. No terror, no trauma, just routine. Push button, enemy dies. Move to next target. That evolution tells you everything about why those first 32 tanks at the Somme mattered more than any battle they fought in, more than any ground they captured, more than any tactical victory they achieved. Because let's be honest about those first tanks, they were ridiculous. By any technical standard, they were barely functional prototypes that had no business being in combat. 18 of the 32 broke down before they even reached German lines, just died in the middle of no man's land from mechanical failure. The remaining ones got stuck in craters, caught fire randomly for no apparent reason, couldn't cross trenches wider than 8 feet, and the Somme was full of trenches wider than 8 feet. Their maximum speed was walking pace. Literally. A man on foot could outrun them. Some of them got so hot inside that the crews abandoned them just to avoid heat stroke, not even under enemy fire. The Germans developed tactics to beat them within weeks. Figured out that armor-piercing rounds could penetrate if you hit them at the right angle. Realized that if you stayed calm and aimed for the tracks, you could immobilize them easily. Learned that artillery crews could knock them out if they didn't panic. Within a month, the tank's psychological advantage was already fading on the Western Front. German soldiers stopped running from them, started fighting back effectively. But none of that mattered. None of the technical failures mattered. None of the tactical counters mattered. Because the psychological door was open, couldn't be closed. Militaries around the world saw those surrendering Germans at the Somme, saw hundreds of men giving up to broken down machines. And they all had the same thought. We need that. Not the machine specifically, not the Mark I tank with all its flaws, but the terror, the psychological weapon, the ability to make the enemy's will collapse before the fighting even starts, the ability to win battles without your own soldiers having to be brave or skilled or willing to die. Just build a better machine, let the machine do the terrifying, let the machine do the killing. And that's why Heinrich's letter is so haunting, because he's not describing a battle, he's not giving a tactical report on a new weapon. He's describing the moment warfare became something his ancestors wouldn't recognize. The moment war stopped being about men and started being about machines. The moment human courage became a quaint, outdated concept that might make for good stories but didn't actually matter on the battlefield anymore. Think about what Heinrich witnessed. For thousands of years, literally thousands of years, war was human against human. The Greeks at Marathon, the Romans at Cannae, medieval knights at Agincourt, Napoleon at Waterloo, the American Civil War. Every war in human history up to that moment had one thing in common. Human qualities determined outcomes. The bravest side, the best trained side, the most disciplined side, they won. Not always. War is chaotic and luck plays a role, but human factors were the primary determinant of victory. Then, in one morning, in one foggy September dawn on the Somme, all of that became negotiable, optional, irrelevant. Now war could be won by whoever builds the better machine. And the humans, the actual soldiers, they just suffer. In new ways, in worse ways, ways that don't even look like traditional combat. The British crews suffered. Speechley and his mates climbed into those steel ovens knowing they might be burned alive, poisoned by fumes, or shredded by their own armour. They weren't charging into battle with rifles and bayonets, testing their courage against the enemy's courage. They were operating machinery, dangerous, poorly designed machinery that was as likely to kill them as the Germans were. That's not warfare, that's industrial accident waiting to happen. That's sacrificing yourself to a machine in hopes that the machine will scare the other side enough to make your sacrifice worthwhile. The Germans suffered differently, but just as badly. Heinrich and his comrades had to face the existential horror of their weapons being useless, their courage being meaningless, their training being obsolete. They had to surrender not because they were beaten in combat, but because fighting was pointless. That's not a military defeat. That's a philosophical defeat. That's having your entire understanding of warfare, of masculinity, of what it means to be a soldier, stripped away in 30 minutes. Everybody lost something that day except the concept of mechanical warfare, which won everything. The idea that wars could be fought by machines, that human factors could be engineered out of combat, that courage and skill could be replaced by industrial production. That idea won the Somme, won World War I, and went on to define every conflict that came after. We've been living in Heinrich's nightmare ever since. Living in a world where drones kill from the sky, operated by pilots sitting in air-conditioned rooms in Nevada, fighting wars in Afghanistan through screens like it's a video game. Where algorithms select targets. Where teenage kids who've never heard a shot fired in anger are pressing buttons that end lives on the other side of the world. Where the human element of warfare has been so thoroughly removed that we don't even call them soldiers anymore. We call them operators, like they're running machinery, which they are, Heinrich's X-shaped devil machine with its imaginary shovels. Because remember, he got the mechanism completely wrong, couldn't even understand what he was looking at. That confused, terrified description from a 22-year-old farmer's son was the beginning of all of it. The first glimpse into a future where war would become something cold, something mechanical, something that happened to people instead of something people did to each other. But there's one last detail in Heinrich's letter that makes this whole story hit different. One sentence that he saved for the end, one line that cuts through all the analysis and tactical discussion and historical significance and just hits you right in the heart. After describing the battle, after explaining the terror, after trying to make sense of the tank and the surrender, and the British crews climbing out looking half dead, after processing this new form of warfare that made him question everything he thought he knew about combat, Heinrich ends his letter with this: "I wonder if the British soldier inside that machine has a mother who worries for him, like mine worries for me." That's it. That's the sentence. And it destroys everything war is supposed to be about. See? War needs enemies. Has to have enemies. The whole thing falls apart without them. War needs the other side to be different, to be less human, to be easier to kill. That's how you get men to fight. That's how you get soldiers to pull triggers and throw grenades and bayonet strangers in trenches. You convince them that the other side isn't quite as human as they are. That the enemy soldiers are fundamentally different in some important way that makes killing them necessary, even righteous. The machine should have made that easier, should have reinforced that distance. You're not fighting men anymore, you're fighting steel. You're fighting engines and tracks and armor plates. The enemy is mechanical now, other, alien. Easy to hate, easy to fight. But Heinrich looked at that tank and saw through it, saw past the armor and the terror and the mechanical horror, saw the scared kid inside sweating in the dark, probably missing home just as much as Heinrich missed his farm in Bavaria, probably wondering if he'd ever see his family again, probably writing his own letters to his own mother, who was probably sitting in some English village worrying herself sick, just like Heinrich's mother was worrying in Bavaria. Both of them trapped in machines. Speechly trapped in a literal machine, 28 tons of steel that was trying to cook him alive. Heinrich trapped in a different kind of machine, the German army, the trench system, the vast mechanical apparatus of war that had pulled him from his farm and put a gun in his hands and told him to kill strangers for reasons he probably didn't fully understand. Both machines designed to strip away their humanity, to turn them into cogs, into operators, into expendable components that could be used up and replaced. The tank was just the most literal expression of what the entire war machine did to everyone it touched, and neither of them had a say in it. That's the part that really matters. Speechley didn't design the tank, didn't ask to crew it, got volunteered or drafted or talked into it by recruiters who promised adventure and glory and left out the part about burning alive inside a steel coffin. Heinrich didn't ask for the war, didn't choose to be an artilleryman. Got conscripted, got trained, got sent to the Somme because the machine needed bodies and he had one. Both of them were just young men who probably would have gotten along fine if they'd met in peacetime. Might have shared a beer, might have talked about farming or family or their hopes for the future, might have been friends, but the machine put them on opposite sides of no man's land and told them to kill each other. And when Speechley's machine won, when Heinrich ended up a prisoner, they never even met. never spoke, never got to confirm their shared humanity. The war machine wouldn't allow it. That's the real story of the Landship's terror, not the technical specifications, not the tactical innovations, not even the psychological impact on the battlefield. The real story is about what gets lost when we let machines do our fighting, what gets buried under all the steel and oil and mechanical efficiency. The ridiculous Landship worked because it revealed a truth we still haven't dealt with, a truth we've been running from for over 100 years now. Modern war doesn't make us stronger or braver or more heroic. It doesn't test our mettle or prove our courage or any of the other noble-sounding things we tell ourselves about combat. It makes us smaller, more fragile, more aware of how little control we have over the violence done in our names. It turns us into operators of machines we didn't build, fighting wars we didn't start, killing people we don't hate, for reasons we might not even understand. And it does this while making us feel powerless, because what can one person do against a tank, against a drone, against the vast, implacable mechanical apparatus of modern warfare? Heinrich's letter survived 100 years, not because tanks are interesting, though they are, and not because the Battle of the Somme was historically significant, though it was. It survived because his question, does that enemy soldier have a mother, is the question every generation has to keep asking, has to keep remembering to ask. Otherwise, we're just building better machines to avoid answering it. Otherwise, we're just perfecting the art of mechanized violence while losing the ability to see the human beings on the receiving end, the ability to imagine their mothers worrying, their families waiting, their hopes and dreams and fears that are probably remarkably similar to our own. The Landship terrified the German army because it worked, because it broke through their defences and shattered their confidence and proved that a new kind of warfare was possible. But it should terrify us because we never stopped building them, never stopped perfecting them. Never stopped finding new ways to distance ourselves from the human cost of violence. We went from tanks to bombers to nuclear weapons to smart bombs to drones to autonomous weapon systems, each step more efficient, each step more mechanical, each step further from the uncomfortable reality of Heinrich's question, further from having to look at the enemy and wonder about their mothers, further from having to see them as human at all. And maybe that's the point. Maybe that's what we've been trying to achieve all along. To make war so mechanical, so distant, so impersonal that we never have to answer Heinrich's question. Never have to face the reality that the person we're killing probably has a mother who loves them. Probably has people waiting for them. Probably isn't that different from us except for the accident of geography and the machine that put us on opposite sides. The first tanks were ridiculous, clumsy, barely functional, but they worked well enough to show us a future where we could wage war without having to be warriors, where we could kill without having to be killers, where we could win battles without having to be brave. Just build a better machine. Let it do the terrible work. Let it carry the moral weight. And we've been running toward that future ever since, getting better at building the machines, getting worse at asking the questions that matter. Heinrich asked the right question, the important question, the question we should still be asking. Does that enemy soldier have a mother who worries for him? The answer is yes. Always yes, in every war, on every battlefield, behind every machine. There's a mother somewhere worrying, there's a human being scared and far from home, wondering if they'll survive. There's someone remarkably like us, on the other side of the armor plate or the ocean or the computer screen, caught in the same mechanical nightmare, serving the same inhuman machine. The Landship's true terror wasn't what it did to the Germans at the Somme. It was what it did to all of us. What it showed us about ourselves, that we're willing to build machines to avoid facing each other, that will choose mechanical efficiency over human connection, that will perfect the art of distant violence while losing the ability to ask Heinrich's question. And we're still making that choice. Every day, every new weapon system, every advancement in military technology. We're still choosing the machine over the question, still choosing efficiency over empathy, still choosing to win without having to acknowledge the cost. Heinrich's letter is a warning. Was a warning in 1916. Still is today. Will be tomorrow. The machines will keep getting better, more efficient, more lethal, more capable of delivering violence without requiring us to face its reality. But the question remains, unchanged, unanswered, waiting for us to be brave enough to ask it. Does that enemy soldier have a mother who worries for them? And if they do, if they're human just like us, scared just like us, far from home just like us, then what does that say about the machines we've built? What does that say about the wars we fight? What does that say about us? What stories from your family's wars echo this? Share below. Let's remember the humans behind the machines.